I caught her red-handed literally with my mail in her hands, standing like she belonged on my front porch. I'm Yates Dorman. I work from home, quiet guy, keep to myself mostly. I moved into this suburban cul-de-sac outside Phoenix for the peace. But peace is impossible when you live under the reign of Wilma Maycroft, the HOA president and self-declared queen of the neighborhood. Wilma is everything you'd expect from a Karen in command. Short platinum bob, pastel cardigans, and a voice that sounds like it's always mid-complaint. She's in her mid-50s and treats the HOA like it's the FBI, IRS, and Vatican rolled into one. From day one, she had her eye on me. "Mr. Dorman," she'd say, stepping right up to my porch without knocking. "Your trash can was visible from the street for 11 minutes after pickup." I timed it. I thought she was just annoying. I didn't know she was dangerous. A few weeks back, I noticed a weird pattern. Packages marked delivered weren't showing up. A letter from my bank arrived opened. My credit card company called about a change of address request that I never filed. Then one Thursday afternoon, I saw her, Wilma, standing at my mailbox, flipping through my mail like it was a damn magazine rack. I opened the door. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" She flinched, then snapped back into her usual entitled tone. "Excuse me, Mr. Dorman, but as HOA president, I have the right to inspect suspicious activity." "That's federal mail. You can't touch it." She waved a hand like I was being dramatic. "You've been receiving oversized packages. That's not allowed under HOA guidelines." Section 4B. I walked straight down the path toward her. "You're stealing my mail." "I'm inspecting it," she said, tucking the envelope under her arm like it belonged to her. "If you're not hiding anything, you shouldn't be worried." She turned and walked off like she owned the sidewalk. I stood there stunned, but I wasn't just going to let it go. The next morning, I installed 2 discrete cameras, one above my mailbox and another angled at the porch. Both motion-activated, high-resolution, and cloud-backed. 3 days later, she came back. Same routine. Opened my mailbox, snatched a padded envelope, tucked it under her sweater like she was shoplifting, and walked away. I got the whole thing on video. I could have gone straight to the cops, but I had a hunch this wasn't a one-time thing. So I waited, let her pile up her own trap. Over the next week, I got footage of her taking mail 3 more times. Bank statements, small packages, even a letter from my cousin in the Navy. I compiled the clips, added timestamps, and printed out stills. I wasn't just going to press charges, I was going to bury the whole corrupt HOA board with her. Because here's what I learned while doing some digging. Wilma wasn't just playing mail thief. She was rerouting residents' HOA violation notices, quietly fining people, pocketing the checks, and blaming administrative errors when folks asked why nothing matched the online portal. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was running a scam, and I had the evidence. All I needed now was the right moment to blow it wide open. It was early Friday morning when I stepped into the Phoenix branch of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service with a manila folder tucked under my arm. I'd barely slept the night before, but adrenaline carried me. I wasn't just some guy with a grievance anymore. I had hard evidence, and I was about to drop it in the lap of the only agency that could actually nail Wilma where it hurt federally. The clerk behind the glass window looked up as I approached. "I need to speak with a postal inspector." "It's about mail theft. I have video." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. She picked up a phone, muttered a few words, and nodded toward a side door. A man in a gray suit and a Phoenix PD badge clipped at his belt met me in a small interview room. Inspector Ray Castellano. Late 40s, no nonsense, and clearly used to people exaggerating neighborhood tiffs. But when I handed over the flash drive and started laying out the timeline dates, times, patterns, his demeanor shifted. "You said you've got her on video entering the mailbox on 4 separate days." He asked, inserting the drive into his laptop. 5, I corrected. "And if you watch the way she handles the mail, she's not just peeking, she takes it. One time she tucks it under her sweater, you'll see." He clicked through the footage silently, then again. When he looked up, his face was flat but focused. This woman's your HOA president? Yep, Wilma Maycroft, and that's not all. I did some background digging. She's been bypassing the HOA's official violation process, telling homeowners they owe fines that don't show up in the online system, then collecting payments directly. I've got copies of one of her letters. She uses a fake P.O. box and a fake title Community Integrity Director. That's not a real position. Castellano leaned back in his chair. You realize this isn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. That's why I'm here. Mail theft alone is a federal offense, but when you add wire fraud, falsified fines, and evidence of her intercepting legal and financial documents, that's the kind of thing that gets people indicted. By Monday, Castellano had me back in the office for a formal statement. He'd already pulled bank records tied to the fake P.O. box. Turned out the account receiving the fines was in the name of a defunct landscaping company Wilma had owned with her ex-husband. She'd kept it alive just long enough to funnel payments through it. When the IRS showed no recent tax filings, that was another nail in the coffin. But I wasn't done. I started reaching out to neighbors carefully. Not everyone was ready to believe the saintly president of the HOA was running a scam. But once I met with Alan and Tasha, a retired couple 3 doors down, things snowballed. She told us we owed $600 for a fence violation, Tasha said, pulling out a printed letter. But when we called the management company, they had no record of it. We paid anyway, she said. If we didn't, we'd be taken to small claims court. She's been threatening people with lawsuits, I asked. Not just threatening, said Alan. She actually filed one against the Harrisons last year. Said their landscaping violated community standards. They spent $2,000 on lawyers before it got dismissed. The more people I talked to, the more I realized this wasn't just about mail theft. Wilma had been running her own private enforcement ring, threatening legal action, issuing fake citations, and collecting off-the-books payments for years. And everyone had been too intimidated, too confused, or too embarrassed to speak up, until now. That weekend, while the inspection service built its case, I took things a step further. I filed a public records request with the city. Turns out Wilma had also been submitting noise complaints and zoning reports under fake names, dozens of them, all targeting residents who had pushed back against her authority. And then came the bombshell. I got a call from Castellano late Tuesday. I need you to come in, he said. There's something you need to see. Back in that same interview room, he slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of envelopes, dozens of them, all intercepted from Wilma's house after a federal search warrant had been executed that morning. Bank documents, jury summons, a few IRS letters, none of them were addressed to her. She wasn't just stealing your mail, Castellano said. She had a whole stash in her attic. We're talking identity theft, tax fraud, you name it. My stomach turned. It gets worse, he continued. There's a ledger, handwritten, with names, addresses, amounts paid, and notes like conflict prone or won't fight back. It's clear she was profiling neighbors. She had a whole system. I leaned back in my chair, silent. Look, Castellano said. We've got enough to charge her with at least 6 federal counts. But we're coordinating with state prosecutors too. There's going to be a joint task force for this one. You might be called to testify. I nodded. I'm ready. That Saturday was the HOA's quarterly meeting. Wilma had no idea the feds were coming for her. She stood at the front of the clubhouse, clipboard in hand, lecturing the room about community discipline and a recent uptick in non-compliant behavior. I walked in late, deliberately. Every chair turned. She paused mid-sentence. Mr. Dorman, she said, her tone like I'd tracked mud into a cathedral. You're not on the agenda. Don't worry, I said. Someone else is. Right on cue, 2 plainclothes agents entered behind me, flashing badges. One of them walked straight up to Wilma and informed her she was under federal investigation. She stammered something about a misunderstanding, but they were already reading her rights. People gasped. Phones came out. The entire neighborhood watched as the woman who'd ruled over them with threats and fake fines was escorted out in handcuffs. No one said a word for a long moment. Then someone in the back clapped. Then another. Soon the whole room was on their feet. And for the first time since I'd moved in, the community actually felt like a community. After the meeting, Alan shook my hand. "You did what none of us could," he said. "You stood up to her." "I just set up a couple cameras," I replied. "The truth handled the rest." But I didn't stop there. With Wilma gone, the HOA board was gutted. 2 of her closest allies resigned within the week. I ran for interim president uncontested and launched a full audit of every violation and fee issued over the past 3 years. We found over 20 homeowners who'd paid her directly. I coordinated with a local attorney to help them seek restitution. We also rewrote the bylaws, transparent processes, independent oversight. All violation notices now had to go through the management company and be documented in a public portal. No more secret fines. No more fake positions. As for Wilma, she ended up indicted on 9 separate charges: mail theft, wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction. She took a plea deal but still got sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to repay over $80,000 in restitution. The mailbox she used to hover around now has a small plaque on it. "Every right begins with standing up." It was Alan's idea. I just made sure it got installed. I didn't expect to be back in City Hall so soon, especially not at a podium facing the entire County Ethics Review Committee. But that's where I found myself 11 days after Wilma's arrest, flipping through a binder of annotated documents while the overhead projector beamed the HOA's fraudulent ledger onto the screen behind me. What began as a case of stolen mail had cracked open something broader, a pattern of systemic abuse that, according to the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, may have violated racketeering statutes. The committee had called a public hearing to determine whether the city's oversight of local HOAs needed reform. Someone from the postal inspector's office mentioned my name. That's how I ended up with a nameplate, a microphone, and a reporter from Channel 7 scribbling notes in the front row. Councilwoman Deidre Vaughn, a sharp-eyed former prosecutor who chaired the committee, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Mr. Dorman, can you walk us through the connection between the HOA's internal practices and the criminal charges filed against Miss Maycroft?" "Absolutely," I said, sliding a paper forward. "This document shows a pattern of financial coercion. Residents were sent fabricated violation letters, none of which were backed by the management company or recorded in the HOA's official tracking system. Payments were funneled into a private account disguised under an inactive LLC. The same account was involved in the recent indictment." I clicked the remote and brought up a set of email headers. "These are spoofed communications sent from a false domain, HOA Integrity.org, which doesn't exist." "And this," I said, flipping to the next page, "is a map of the properties targeted. All of them were either newly purchased homes or belonged to residents who had filed previous complaints. It wasn't enforcement, it was retaliation." Councilwoman Vaughn didn't blink. "And you're certain this wasn't limited to Miss Maycroft alone?" I nodded. "That's where it gets worse." I pulled out a notarized affidavit, recently delivered by a former board member who had resigned the previous year. It detailed a series of private meetings held without quorum, during which Wilma and 2 others voted to issue fines, deny permit requests, and even approve third-party surveillance of select homes, all off the record. The room went still. "She had the HOA operating like her own private tribunal," I said. "And no one stopped her because she used the rules to silence dissent. Residents feared retaliation, not just from her, but from the system that let her do it." Vaughn tapped her pen against the desk. "Mr. Dorman, if you could recommend one immediate reform to prevent this from happening again, what would it be?" I didn't hesitate. "Mandatory third-party audits, every year, publicly accessible. Plus, a system where residents can anonymously report HOA misconduct directly to the city. There were nods across the dais. A man from the state's Office of Consumer Protection leaned over and whispered something to his colleague. Outside the chamber, I ran into someone I didn't expect: Officer Brendan Holtz, the local beat cop who used to patrol our neighborhood. He'd always seemed unimpressed by HOA drama, but now he looked at me with a different kind of respect. "Didn't think you'd be the one to blow this out of the water," he said, shaking my hand. "I didn't either," I admitted, "but here we are." "You might want to keep your head down for a bit," he added. "We've got 2 other board members under subpoena." One of them tried to wipe her hard drive when the feds came knocking. That night, I got a phone call from a woman named Carla Finch. She introduced herself as the attorney representing a group of affected residents from other subdivisions where Wilma had previously served on interim boards. Apparently this hadn't been her first rodeo. "She's left a trail," Carla said. "We're organizing a multi-neighborhood civil suit. Would you be willing to sign on as a witness?" "Absolutely," I said. "You're about to see how deep this actually goes." Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, things were shifting quickly. A temporary board had been appointed under court supervision, and the first thing they did was hire a forensic accountant. Within 72 hours, he uncovered over $28,000 in misappropriated funds, all tucked away under vague line items like community beautification and administrative contingencies. When the community heard that the old board had been using HOA money to pay for catered lunches and private mediation attorneys, without disclosing it, people were livid. A town hall was called. Not a formal HOA meeting, but a true community gathering at the park near the entrance, the kind of grassroots rally that hadn't happened in years. About 70 people showed up. Folding chairs, coolers, and even a homemade poster that read "Accountability begins on our street." I stepped up to speak, but the real moment came when Mrs. Ortega, a 70-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, took the mic. "I've lived through hard times," she said. "I've seen bullies in every form, but I never thought I'd see one hiding behind a badge that said community leader. I paid a fine last year that made me choose between groceries and medication. Now I know it wasn't even legal." The crowd fell quiet. "That's not a neighborhood," she continued. "That's extortion." People began clapping, not the kind of polite applause you give out of obligation, but the kind that rumbles from the chest. And just like that, the mood shifted from outrage to unity. The next morning, I received a certified letter. It was from the State Bar of Arizona. Apparently, Wilma had falsely claimed to be a licensed paralegal in multiple HOA violation notices. The bar was investigating her for unauthorized practice of law, a felony under state statute. I called Castellano to let him know. "We're already on it," he said. Turns out she drafted her own cease and desist letters with fake docket numbers. She even forged a judge's signature once. That one's going to the U.S. attorney. At that point, the case had ballooned: state charges, federal charges, and now civil liability across multiple communities. And while Wilma waited in pre-trial detention, her former allies were cutting deals left and right. One of them, a man named Gregory Lynn, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. He turned over an external hard drive that contained internal emails, private surveillance footage of residents, and even recordings of phone calls that Wilma had made bragging about her influence over the board and mocking residents who would never figure it out. Those recordings went public through court filings. When local news stations played them on the evening broadcast, any remaining support she had evaporated. Meanwhile, the civil suit moved forward. I signed my statement and sent Carla everything I had. The footage, the letters, the timestamps, even the audio from a meeting where Wilma claimed she had the power to make people disappear from this neighborhood. As for the HOA itself, the court-appointed administrator did what no one else had managed in years. Rewrote the bylaws with input from actual residents, capped board terms at 2 years, and banned any single person from holding multiple officer positions at once. We even held our first fair election. People volunteered, people voted, it felt real. I didn't run for anything. I'd done what I came to do. Instead, I walked the neighborhood that evening, seeing things I hadn't noticed in a while: kids riding bikes again, porch lights on, neighbors actually talking across driveways instead of hurrying inside. A man I didn't recognize stepped out from his garage and waved. "You're the guy who caught her, right?" I nodded. "Thanks," he said. "We needed someone to remind us we're not just property codes and fines, we're people." He turned back inside, leaving me standing in the quiet glow of a place that finally felt like home. And for the first time since moving in, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to come after me. I felt like I belonged. The last week of May brought a sharp heat wave and a sharper shift in public sentiment. The neighborhood that had once whispered its grievances now buzzed with purpose. Lawn signs began popping up, not for elections, but with messages like "We watch the watchers" and "No more shadows." It wasn't just symbolic, it was a signal. The era of silent compliance was over. The temporary board requested volunteers for the HOA ethics committee, something that hadn't functioned properly in years. I didn't sign up, but I helped draft the new charter. This time, the rules weren't written in vague, weaponizable language. They were plain, enforceable, and required a rotating panel of unpaid residents. No one would ever again hold unchecked power behind a title. But as the neighborhood looked forward, the legal system kept pulling the past into the light. A week after the public town hall, I was contacted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Nadine Holbrook. She'd been assigned to the financial crimes portion of the case and wanted a deposition. We met at the federal courthouse downtown, where I walked her through the timeline using a digital timeline I'd compiled, complete with metadata, cloud storage verifications, and a chain of custody for the footage. "I've never seen a civilian organize evidence this cleanly," she said as she flipped through my printed binder. "I didn't want her slipping through a crack," I replied. Holbrook nodded once, then pulled out a sealed manila folder. "She wasn't working alone," she said, laying the contents across the table. "We've identified a third-party property consultant she was funneling money through. He's based out of Flagstaff. We believe he was helping her launder funds by issuing fake landscaping and maintenance invoices." I scanned the documents. The name on the invoices wasn't familiar, but the address listed on the checks was Wilma's sister's place in Sedona. "Do you have evidence of communication between them?" I asked. Holbrook tapped her laptop. "Not yet, but we're subpoenaing her devices. I'll let you know what we find." By the time I got home that night, 2 more residents had placed folding chairs on their front lawns with coolers beside them. Watching not just the street, but each other's backs. A silent form of neighborhood patrol, not vigilantes, not paranoid, just awake. The next morning, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled into the cul-de-sac. 2 agents stepped out and knocked on the door of 1083 Briar Hollow Lane. It belonged to Edwin Nevers, the former HOA treasurer who had disappeared from meetings 2 months before Wilma's arrest. He didn't answer. The agents returned the next day with a warrant. What they found inside shifted the narrative completely. The garage had been turned into a makeshift records room. Boxes labeled "Archive Private" lined the far wall. Inside were ledgers, handwritten notes, even audio cassettes, some dating back 5 years. One of them was a recording of Edwin and Wilma discussing how to rotate fines across the neighborhood to avoid suspicion. Another tape included a conversation about a homeowner who had refused to pay a fake violation. Wilma suggested delaying their permit approvals until they move out. But the worst was a USB drive hidden inside a hollowed-out electrical outlet. On it were spreadsheets with sensitive homeowner data, social security numbers, copies of driver's licenses, even scanned pay stubs. The files had been compiled over years and included not just current residents but applicants who had never been approved to move in. The breach was massive. Holbrook called me that evening. "There's a real chance this tips the case into RICO territory," she said. "We've got coordinated mail theft, financial fraud, identity theft, and coercion tactics designed to suppress resistance. It's no longer just about Wilma, it's about the entire apparatus she built." I didn't say anything for a moment. My stomach had gone cold. "You think she was planning to sell the data?" I asked. Holbrook didn't answer directly. "We're coordinating with Homeland Security now." A week later, the entire neighborhood received a letter, this time from the Department of Justice. It confirmed that residents may have been victims of data theft and offered free credit monitoring for 5 years. Enclosed was a list of recommended actions: monitor accounts, file fraud alerts, contact the FTC. The fallout came fast. A total of 4 people were indicted: Wilma, Edwin, the consultant in Flagstaff, and a former HOA vice chair who had resigned quietly last September. Their charges included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, unlawful possession of identification documents, obstruction of justice, and criminal enterprise under Arizona's racketeering statutes. At the arraignment, the courtroom was packed. I sat behind the prosecution, 2 rows back. Wilma entered in a beige jumpsuit, wrists bound, her once pristine bob now clipped short and uneven. She didn't look at anyone. The judge denied bail. Over the next 3 months, the case built momentum, drawing media attention from across the state. A local podcast ran a 5-part series titled "The HOA That Went Too Far," and a retired judge wrote an op-ed calling for statewide reform of homeowner associations. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the Arizona State Legislature inviting me to speak at a special session on HOA oversight. I declined. Instead, I gave them my timeline, my documentation, and the new bylaws we'd adopted in the neighborhood with a note at the bottom. "If we could do this without lawyers or lobbyists, so can you?" By late August, sentencing began. The consultant received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution. The former vice chair negotiated a plea deal and received 18 months of supervised release. Edwin Nevers got 4 years and a lifetime ban from holding any fiduciary or governance position in a community organization. Wilma, however, went to trial. Her attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, citing stress and long-term cognitive issues. But the jury didn't bite. The evidence was overwhelming: videos, emails, financial records, and testimony from over a dozen residents, including me. She was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole, and ordered her to pay $112,000 in restitution to affected homeowners. She was also banned permanently from serving on any board or managing any civic entity. After the sentencing, I walked past the courthouse steps where a small crowd of reporters waited. One of them called my name, asked for a quote. I just said, "She thought she ran the neighborhood. Turns out the law still runs the country." Back home, things settled into a rhythm. The temporary board transitioned into a permanent one with staggered terms and quarterly open forums. A retired high school principal was elected president, calm, practical, and refreshingly uninterested in power. The cameras I'd installed, they stayed up. Not out of paranoia, but because they were now part of a neighborhood watch system managed by volunteers and monitored only when needed. Every homeowner had access to the recordings, no secrets, no shadow rules. One evening, I stepped outside to find a group of kids riding scooters down the sidewalk. They waved as they passed, and I waved back. Across the street, someone was grilling. Music played softly from a speaker tucked behind a flower bed. It felt like the neighborhood had exhaled. Mrs. Ortega walked by with her dog and stopped at the end of my driveway. "You know," she said, "for a guy who just wanted to be left alone, you shook the whole damn tree." "I didn't plan to. No one ever does," she said. "But thank you." As she walked off, I looked down the street at the row of clean mailboxes, each one standing untouched, each one exactly where it should be. It was never about the mail. It was about what it represented: privacy, trust, the assumption that your home was yours, not some fiefdom controlled by unchecked authority. And now, finally, it was again. Not because someone gave it back, but because we took it.